Hello, hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with me, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan. And this week we'll be joined by a special guest, Jon Marks, Chairman of Cross Border Information. First, we'll have the headlines.
In This Week in the Middle East, Israeli delegates met in Paris with Qatari, Egyptian and US mediators for talks about a possible ceasefire in Gaza. Egypt has signed a deal with the UAE to develop a prime stretch of its Mediterranean coast that could initially involve $35 billion worth of investment. Qatar has announced plans for a further large increase in liquefied natural gas production, despite US gas prices trading near an all-time low. And Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund says that the kingdom could be a hub for artificial intelligence activity outside the United States.
So there you have it. It's all happening. Now let's find our friends, and we bring in Eddie. Hello, Eddie.
Hello, Francis.
And Jon, hello. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Hello, Francis, and hello, Eddie.
Jon, Chairman of Cross Border Information.
Indeed.
And you have specialized in North Africa and African affairs, I think.
I have for a very, very long time, yes.
So if I may, can I start by asking about Algeria, that country which has stayed steady throughout the last period of chaos in the Middle East? How did it stay on track?
Well, I think if you look at Algeria's history, it was extremely violent during the 1990s and the conflict. It emerged from that with a very strong military security apparatus in place. And that, together with a business and political elite that were complicit with the military staying in charge, was extremely important for keeping the Algerian regime in power. When there have been popular uprisings of people showing discontent at the political system and the economic system, those have been largely crushed. There's been a degree of co-option. But what you have got, it is a system. And what's been really, to my mind, extremely remarkable is that people probably remember in 2019, you had Al-Hirak, the movement, the popular movement, came out on the streets against President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who had been a great figure in Algerian politics, was by then both enfeebled and at the center of a regime whose level of corruption was unacceptable even by Algerian standards. Bouteflika was eventually driven out. A new president, Abdelmadjid Tabboune, was elected. He was elected with the backing of some factions in the military. But what was really the most interesting thing there, I think, is that Tabboune is another sort of production line politician. He is likely to stand for re-election again later this year, although there are still, in a very Algerian way, behind the scenes debates over whether that will happen. But the important point is to look at the military security establishment. So what happened was twofold. On the one hand, they took apart the Bouteflika regime. There have been lots and lots of trials, arrests, imprisonment of people who were very close to Bouteflika and the regime, particularly around his brother Said, who ran the kind of the family business. That's been very popular within Algeria. But what also happened that they couldn't calculate for is shortly after Tabboune got elected in November 2019, the man who seemed to be holding the strings, Ahmed Gaid Salah, the chief of staff, suddenly died. Now you have a corpulent man coming up to his 80s. It's not surprising he dies, but it was still a political shock. And that shock was because Gaid Salah had been pulling the strings. What we then got was, I think, the most interesting thing, and the thing that tells you a lot about Algeria, was a political transition in which Tabboune was there. He's been able to pull some of the levers of the presidency to be quite strongly in power. But even more interesting was the way that the chief of staff, the new one, who'd been in Guide Salah's wake, Saeed Shanigra, came through the system and very quickly became the powerful person. So we now have a situation, 2019, 2020, where you have a new prime minister, but he's kind of a bit identikit politician, doesn't quite have Bouteflika's historic depth. You have a military establishment, many of whose members have actually been purged. You have a business establishment that's been purged that was around Bouteflika. But out of that comes another military establishment, equally in position, under Shingriha, with its values. The Hirak movement is then it's either politically crushed, lots of arrests of its members, those people who might be viable opposition leaders, arrested, harassed, very much like their friends in Russia, and they don't understand what President Putin does. But also the opposition, it's weak, it's divided. And basically, you then have COVID, so people go behind closed doors. But basically, you have a system that has completely remade itself in its own image, while at the same time changing quite a lot of things.
And who's Algeria's main allies who are its friends in the Arab world?
Well, in the Arab world, Algeria would probably say Syria still. They've been quite instrumental in getting Syria into the Arab League, obviously back into the Arab League. Obviously, you need sign-off from some of the Gulf states in the way that things have risen up. But Algeria is a strangely isolated place. It's defined to some degree by its enemies. So clearly Morocco, the Cold War that goes on between Algeria and Morocco. And I've been warning for the last 2-3 years at least that people should really look at this very clearly. There's potential for substantial conflict. Obviously, the two sides are in total conflict over the disputed Western Sahara, where Algeria supports the Polisario Front independence movement, and Morocco, of course, claims sovereignty. That's really worth coming back to, because that tells us a lot about the alliances in the region. There would be sympathy probably with Egypt, but Egypt and Algeria never get on very well. There's general suspicion, and I think they don't take the Libyan leaderships very seriously. Tunisia, Algeria has been projecting its force, economic and political, on Syria and on Tunisia, and the Tunisians are worried. And in the Arab world, it's really not love. There've been for quite a long time, there was talk that Mohammed bin Salman was going to visit Algiers. That never happened. The Qataris, they don't particularly trust at all, even though with people like Hamas, they have friends in common. And the UAE, quite frankly, relations are very poor.
Yes. When I first got to the UAE, ADNOC, Abu Dhabi was full of Algerians, because they were one of the very few world Arab oil producers who had the experience.
Absolutely.
Eddie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, that's a great tour d'horizon, John. Fantastic, really great. The issue that's been concerning us, obviously, this year in our conversation is about Gaza. So where does Algeria stand on Gaza? It's the last great pillar still standing of what we used to call the front against Israel. Is that position still true? And in what role does Algeria feel? How important is Gaza to Algeria and Algerians? And what role do you think Algeria would like to play, if anything, in any kind of resolution?
Well, Algeria would obviously like to be at centre stage. It is a country that defines itself by its diplomacy and the positions it's in. For example, people I know have been talking about Tabboune and the way he is on the international stage compared to Bouteflika, of course, who was, one of the great foreign ministers of the non-aligned movement and after. And saying, Tabboune really isn't, he's an embarrassment to us, the way he behaved. He's not up to behaving in the Algerian fashion. Algeria is always good to look at two levels. There's the level of elite politics, and there's the level of popular sentiment. And one place where I would say there is real consensus in Algeria is over the issue of Palestine. People have been brought up from a country which, after all, was born out of extremely bloody conflict and difficult post-colonial years. People are very, very solid about Palestine, no matter who they are. You know, they will be very strong. And also there's an association between Palestinian and the Polisario Front and them trying to get independence in the Western Sahara. And I think people generally still really are strongly behind that. Within the ruling establishment, there are clearly, you know, cynics who will use these things for cynical purposes. But there's also, similar to the grassroots, there's an ideology in Algeria. Algerians believe in stuff. They actually believe in their country. They still, some will be very disaffected towards their militaries. Others will still really strongly believe it. And they believe in the Palestinian cause, and they believe in the Western Sahara. Now, within the elite, and we talked about Said Shingriha before, the chief of staff and the people around him are extremely motivated by the Palestinian question and by the Polisario question. They get very excited. I think clearly after the Hamas attack, the Algerian leadership got very excited because they are people who believe in the use of political violence outside the country. And extremely anti-Israeli. You know, there was no fear of an Abraham Accord coming through Algiers, and I think that is still a very much an issue that's there. There's no ambiguity.
So do they have any sort of active links with either the Palestinian Authority or with Hamas, or who do they actually work with?
They'd work with everyone. They'd be close to both sides. I mean, I think they'd be uneasy about Hamas, given Hamas and his Palestinian Islamic Jihad's roots. Clearly, you've got an Algerian regime that's no friend of the Muslim Brotherhood, or indeed other forms of radical Islam. But equally, these are Palestinian groups. So Palestinian Authority would be the natural home. You know, we're talking corrupt, gerontocratic, and sclerotic. I mean, what's not to like on both sides? With all due respect to those involved.
If I may, let's move on and take a look at.
I'll just mention one other point.
Yeah.
In this. Is that the Algerians, as we mentioned before, Bouteflika was a great foreign minister in the non-aligned movement, and the Algerians would love to create a non-aligned kind of basis. So they were, I think, more enraged, upset than anyone at not getting BRICS membership. For however much it's worth, it was kind of offered to the UAE or Saudi Arabia, who's still thinking, well, you know, so what? Ethiopia, it was huge. Their amour propre was absolutely, they were expecting, because their two closest allies, Vladimir Putin and Russia, and South Africa, with whom Algeria has very close ties. I mean, the BRICS summit last summer, as we know, or last winter as it was, because it was in South Africa, was in South Africa. The Russians had said, you know, no problems at all, we're supporting you. The Algerians really, nowhere I can think of, really played up BRICS membership like, this is it, we're joining the big guys here in the new front. And there was almost a crisis in Algiers after they didn't get to join. But the other factor is that the promise from Russia, the Russian relationship is very close. You still got a case that senior Algerian officers, Chief of Staff Chingricha, was a military student in Russia during the Soviet time. He's extremely close. We've seen in the period since the Ukraine war, not just Algeria being sympathetic towards Russia, but actually having live fire exercises near the Moroccan border with Russian forces. And while the Algerians have always rejected rejected with a lot of nuance, Russian overtures to open a military base on the Mediterranean coast in Algeria, that is not excluded. It's a very close relationship. So to answer Eddie's question, who are they actually siding with? The Algerians very much see themselves, I think, as the spirit of traditional Arab nationalist values. They would prefer the rather more secular, in as much as the state of non-Islamic allies. They side very much with their fellow autocrats, particularly with Russia, where there's always been huge business dealings around arms sales and whatever. And they have allies who are outside Algeria, but they really do want to raise their status. So I think it's kind of complex, but you look at it, there's a mixtures of ideology, pragmatism, and emotion in this.
And it was quite telling, wasn't it, that the Security Council resolution that was actually not approved, but it was the one for the ceasefire resolution was moved by Algeria.
Absolutely.
So that another sign, is it not, of Algeria wanting to demonstrate where it stands?
Algeria is unambiguous in this, and they're unambiguous also in the support coming up from the street. So yes, absolutely.
Fascinating, interesting. Thank you. To going around Algeria, it's because it stays there, we tend to miss it. But it's a huge country, and I'm glad to have caught up with it.
Ever since South Sudan was created, it is Africa's largest country.
Is it?
Yeah,
I thought Sudan still okay.
It was always second, but when South Sudan was created. Out of Sudan and the rump being in the north, Algeria moved to number one in Africa. It's big.
Well, moving on to another country with a few rumps hanging around, Libya.
Yes.
Libya is split between the internationally recognized government in Tunis and the Egyptian UAE-backed Haftar. Do you see them? They've lasted together now for about several years, and are they just going to stay like that? Are they going to advance together? Are they going to succeed in merging, or are they going to stay two kind of frenemies, occasionally doing deals but deadly rivals?
Frenemies is an interesting way of putting it, Francis, because you have. The thing that Gaddafi did was welding Libya together. There's no historically, if you look at the map of Libya, when I was studying North African history, we actually had a rule of thumb that the western part of North Africa, the Maghreb, obviously you have Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, but also Tripolitania, that half of Libya being split down, whereas Cyrenaica was much more emotionally, politically aligned with events to the east, where you have Egypt. And Gaddafi, and then the south, of course, is this kind of rather more amorphous part, really, of Africa coming down into the Sahel. And Gaddafi welded that together. Now, as he fell apart, it's quite intriguing that the country actually did hold together. So you have two separate power bases, as you rightly say. Alliances shift. People of, I think, the Egyptians and the Emiratis were rather wedded to Haftar, but he's not the easiest or most satisfactory of allies. On the other side, the West, the so-called international community, the internationally recognized government is in Tripoli. But Tripolitania itself is very divided. Towns like Misrata with its militia, the town of Zintan up in the west with its militia. These are all powerful groups. The government of national unity in Tripoli is a strange beast under Abdulhamid al-Dabeiba, who continues to pull the strings. Rather doing some policies, my colleague John Hamilton, who follows this very closely from very early on, was arguing, well, you look at Dabeiba, he's actually doing things that he would have done during the Gaddafi period, pulling together money, the people enriching themselves out of the oil. Libya's in a kind of stasis. There doesn't seem to be a military breakthrough going to happen. It's probably in both sides' interests not to have necessarily a political breakthrough.
Because Haftar's forces at one stage were surrounding Tripoli.
He was the government in Tripoli at that stage was effectively staved by the Turks.
Yes,
it was that moment. It was both the militia from Misrata, but the Turkish intervention, which was interesting, showing people just how effective a Turkish intervention could be, which possibly years later also helped Qatar during the boycott period. So a stasis is kind of there. There's a big issue. Can they keep on pumping enough oil to oil some of the wheels? National Oil Corporation, both its eastern and its western variants, has fought hard to actually keep that part of the economy going, and actually they've managed to ramp up production quite a bit, even with problems. Libya is producing 1.2 million barrels a day, and then some condensate as well. So, it's a place that's in stasis. It does nobody any particular good. If you look at Africa and the way that the number of armed groups, militias have actually come and impacted on what happens in the Sahel, it's done it a lot of bad, as we know. It's got some horrific problems, not least the pressures for people trying to migrate to Europe, coming up from the south, whose experience by and large is absolutely appalling. But it's in a kind of stasis. It's very rare to see a suggestion that either side is going to break through. So it remains extremely difficult, but to a degree functioning place, filled with gangs, militias, money that's not the cleanest. A huge problem for Europeans, problem for Egyptians on the other side as well. They watch it very, very closely.
Isn't that why the Egyptians and therefore the Emiratis, they plunged in to kind of secure their border by supporting Haftar quite a few years ago? For
the Egyptians, undoubtedly, yes. I mean, I can remember being on the Egyptian border in 2011, just after Benghazi, in the March of 2011, after Gaddafi had fallen and Benghazi was independent but under pressure. And at the border, it was teeming with African migrants and indeed other migrants. It was much easier. You could get a cab at the border to go to Benghazi the other way very easily because no one was traveling west to east. But that situation remains remains there, but it's in stasis. I don't think anyone trusts Haftar. The UAE seems to still be a player, but has pulled back. But it went into Haftar because he was the radically anti-Ikhwan. He was the anti-Muslim Brotherhood candidate. A man, after all, who was a Gaddafi general who fell out with Gaddafi and was on the CIA payroll, living very happily in Washington for 30 years before he came back during the Arab Spring. So Libya's in a kind
Eddie, do you want to jump in?
Oh, no, nothing particular. And it is quite striking that given that the disintegration of Libya was at least partly, I would say largely, the result of international intervention, that the lack of energy from the international community to actually put it all back together again is rather striking. Have I got that wrong? Is the European Union and the international community really indifferent?
I think
Libya is now effectively not only divided, but in a state of great chaos.
I think there are things that people have forgotten, and there's narratives, particularly that come out of France, because people hate Sarkozy so much, probably with reason, but it doesn't mean that some of the decisions that were made then. There was a big problem in Libya, which was that after Gaddafi fell, there were all these competing groups who didn't get on. As I say, Gaddafi, through the iron fist, had kept this country together, which arguably wasn't a country at all. And in those battles, the groups who were in government, representing government, did not want Western powers intervening and telling them which way to go. I mean, like if you went into, say, the British Foreign Office in 2012, you would be falling over yourself with different groups of Libyans who we were trying to sort of help. There was aid, state building, all these kind of ideas. But the fact is, the groups didn't want them. They wanted to do their own thing. That's absolutely fine. Getting rid of Muammar Gaddafi was about giving Libyan self-determination. And certainly I can remember being in Libya in that period in 2011, the actual degree, no one was turning around and saying, oh, what a pity for Gaddafi. They all knew if you were in the centre of Benghazi, there were still people picking over the mounds of where his prisons had been, trying to find the bodies from decades ago of their family members. It wasn't love. But the West kind of forgetting about it. Now, the West has a very short memory, as I'm sure people like President Putin are planning to exploit. But there was also the fact that some of the things that people wanted to do weren't particularly doable if you weren't going to impose a kind of post-colonial order on things. That's my own take on it. The overthrow of Gaddafi was about self-determination, and the Libyans wanted to do it themselves, and that posed a whole load of problems. But that's what happened. And my one disagreement with a lot of the conventional narratives about Libya at that time does stem from that. It wasn't that people weren't trying to do stuff. It was actually that the Libyans, quite correctly in many respects, wanted to actually assert for the first time their own rights and their own self-determination to do what they wanted. And things then escalated from there. Other people became involved. The country fell apart to a very dangerous extent. I mean, I mentioned before the fact that in the Sahel and other parts, you had all these arms. Come back to our friends in Algeria. The Algerians are quite rightly saying, look, this place is falling apart. Look at the amount of weapons, which there were huge numbers, that are coming into Algeria and funding jihadist groups in Algeria or in their near abroad in places like Mali. And still, we look at things going on in the Sahel now and talk to people. These things are still happening. Libya.
John, talking about the Sahel there, you've got groups there which are fairly embedded. I mean, they've made their alliances with desert groups, with tribes that they've got quite firmly stuck in. And with the sort of rather weak nation states or governance on places like Mali and Niger, even Chad is looking much weaker than it did. You've got groups down there, Islamists, who are going to stay there for a long time, which I see as a major danger.
Well, it is, but I mean, there are even bigger. There are just a huge number of risks around the Sahel. I mean, for starters, you've got the world's poorest countries. I mean, it's not, you look at by any indicator, fast-growing populations still in very poor countries, ethnically divided. I mean, those states were in the colonial boundaries that were fitted, Congress of Berlin and thereafter. There's no logic. Hence why, for example, you have that fault line in Mali where you have the Tuareg.
Yes.
You have the Tuareg groups, and then you have other communities, ethnicities going. You have Chad, you mentioned, where under the sun, Mahamat Idris Deby of the late Idris Deby, who was killed fighting rebels who'd come in from Libya. But in Chad, you have a very small ethnic clique, the Zagawa, about 5% of the population, who actually Idris Deby, the people he was fighting, they all come from the Zagawa. So you've got lots and lots of cleavages. You've also got, as you rightly said, these are very weak states that have had moments, but are going through a very bad situation. I mean, now there's been the 3 coups d'etat, first of all in Mali, where they had 2, followed by Burkina Faso, and then the one that really shocked the West, Niger. In each of those cases, they went to throw out the French. Yes. In each case, there's a wide degree of popular. I think the degree to which the West is alienated from the global South, I think people up where we are have completely missed the point. Oh, yes. And misunderstood, because actually people are getting away with some really terrible things, using the very large groundswell of anti-Western feeling, very well exploited by the Russians in their game plan, using, it's those Facebook groups funded by Russia. In fact, when you had by the time we got to the Niger coup, people bringing Russian flags out onto the street. So you've got a large number of big issues there, but also with the French, it shouldn't be forgotten that when the French intervention in Mali happened in 2013,
yes,
Operation Barkhane, that was ordered by François Hollande, not because he wanted to put a colonial force into Mali, but that actually that jihadists were rolling down the road to take Bamako. And that's being forgotten. On the ground, they clearly are not doing very well. In the places where the coups have happened, the link up with the Wagner Group, or the newly renamed African Legion, is.
And it's still there.
Oh yeah, they're not going anywhere. They're making money. They have a good business model, which is basically resources for muscle. The center of all of those operations is guarding the presidential palace. The soldiers that have come to power are making money. Everyone else is pretty much suffering, but there's such, I think there's the public mood is clearly, you know, plague on all your houses. They're not suddenly saying, well, we want the Americans to come back.
No.
It's a very difficult situation. The people who are benefiting, and as you implied, could be jihadist groups and others, because basically, Wagner is not a replacement for the kind of Western force that's in there. They go. There's a genuinely, not from Western propaganda, but just from what people are looking at, the number of atrocities that go on is pretty bad. Once the special forces of the Malians and the Russians get out, there's been some really terrible massacres. So it will probably end badly for them. The interesting thing is the big challenge will come is if those groups that look like overthrowing the regimes in 2013 gain more ground, then, it's not inconceivable that something could happen. We already know that with the Russians, the one case in Mozambique where they came in, which obviously is much more attractive from a resources point of view. And the Wagner came in for a short period of time a couple of years ago to try and deal with the Islamist insurgency around the gas fields in northern Mozambique. And they got thwacked.
Eddie, you're going to jump in?
Well, John, Africa are very intriguing, greatly misunderstood, not a place you can generalize about, as people attempt to do. Vast country, more than 1 billion people. But I just wanted to maybe bring this back to a Middle East topic, which is South Africa's role in the ICJ in Gaza. Now, you're a regular visitor to South Africa. You're very familiar with the government and its motivations. What does it really think it's trying to achieve here? Really trying to achieve? I mean, there's more than one thing, I'm sure. And what do they think, and what are they saying to you will happen as a result of the ICJ action?
Well, the ICJ action, the ruling was a kind of success, but only a partial one, depending which way you look at it. I think on South Africa, the interesting point is that South Africa's own problems have become so acute that people have rather forgotten the kind of moral high ground and the positions that South Africa always took. So on Palestine, I mean, South Africa, Israel, remember there is a Jewish community in South Africa, and also particularly in South African Communist Party during apartheid and after, those were South African Jews who were an important part of that and were on the radical side. But of course, you don't have to be Jewish to support what Israel does. But there is South Africa, to me, in some respects, when you look at the popular ideology and sentiment, is similar to its old friend Algeria. And that there was, when Ramaphosa came in and they led on the ICJ, to South Africans, it was kind of natural. My first instinct, being cynical far too long in the tooth journalist who's looked at these things, to say, who's got the angle, who's got the advantage here? One person did get a bit of advantage out of it, but I'm not even sure that's what he was particularly looking for. It was actually that's what South Africa traditionally does. Now, the place, we've had state capture, we've had high levels of criminality, we've got what was 30 years ago the fourth largest electricity utility in the world, reduced to having 6-8 hours a day load shedding, which is what they call it. We call them power cuts for people. The place is in a mess, but it still has some values. And so I think South Africa was behaving a bit like South Africa, and the African National Congress, the ANC, was trying to behave a bit like it's expected to. And interestingly, Cyril Ramaphosa, who after all is as besieged on the left as he is on the right in South African politics, actually benefited. In the immediate period after the ICJ vote, there was a lot of pundits in South Africa and a little bit of polling, because of course we are talking about a serious country where political polls mean something. A bit of polling would say that Ramaphosa actually got a bounce out of this, because people actually believed it. Unfortunately, having got that bounce, people are going to go home and think, well, I haven't got any lights, hope the generator's working tonight.
Yeah, but what do they think is going to result from that? I mean, you're saying they did it out of a matter of principle. This is the ANC, the traditional, highly principled liberation movement, reaching out to a traditional partner. But what do they think they're going to achieve? That's it? They think that's it. That we've had our say. The ICJ will rule.
I think they'll look for the process to continue. There are those in South Africa who said it's not going anywhere. There's others who will say it's going somewhere. I think there isn't a definitive judgment. I think if you want to look at it in South African context, Parliament breaks up in May, and sometime between May and August, to fit the Constitution, they're going to have an election. And it's a big election. The odds are that the ANC will end up still as the largest party, but it will lose its absolute majority, and the prospects for coalition building are not particularly pretty. On its plus side, that it wants to take to the bank during that election, is the fact that South Africa very visibly and publicly stood up for the Palestinians, which a large majority of South Africans would agree with. Again, like Algeria on the question of Gaza, you have consensus where in other issues there may not be consensus at all. And I think politically that's what they gain, but it's not going to be the defining issue. But certainly the ANC have a lot of ties. The ANC, unlike actually their leaderships, had quite good ties with Hamas, as well as even more than PA. So there's links there, or radical movements, and they're not so worried about the Islamist element.
I think with that thought, we have to pause. Sadly, looking at South Africa, all the ICJ thing is more from a domestic South African point of view rather than anything to do with what's happening in Gaza. John, thank you very much. We're going to close down.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, John.
So there we are. And thank you very much for listening. If you have any comments.
It was fine.
If you have any comments, please come on and have a talk or join us on the website. Meanwhile, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.